Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the AME History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past, what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
In this episode of AME History Podcast, host Wendy Aris sits down with Professor Ryan Mann-Hamilton, historian and Caribbean migration scholar, to explore one of the most overlooked chapters of Atlantic world history, the forgotten migration from the United States to Hispaniola. Professor Mann-Hamilton unpacks the movement of free African Americans who relocated to Hispaniola during the 19th century, why they left, how they settled, and the complex political dynamics that shaped their lives once they arrived. Together, Wendy and Professor Mann-Hamilton trace the cultural, linguistic, and genealogical legacies that this migration left behind, revealing stories of resilience, reinvention, and community building that continue to shape the region today. Join us as we recover a migration history often left out of textbooks and illuminate the powerful ties between the U.S., Haiti, and the Dominican Republic.
I just wanted to thank you so much for Professor Mann-Hamilton for coming on to the podcast, AME History, and to speak about your article, Forgotten Migrations from the United States to Hispaniola. As I found that, you wrote from a personal perspective in terms of your own genealogy and, of course, this type of migration that people wouldn't expect from the United States to the West Indies. So before we start, can I just have you just do a brief introduction of yourself?
Yeah, sure. My name is Ryan Mann-Hamilton. I'm a professor of anthropology and Caribbean studies at LaGuardia, CUNY LaGuardia in New York City. I'm born and raised in Puerto Rico. My family is from Samaná and from many other locations across the Caribbean as well. And so this was, again, some of the labor of love that I've been doing for at least 15 years now. It became sort of an educational pursuit, but really this is a personal pursuit more than anything.
Yes, personally. And, we'll start and what first inspired you to explore this history? Was there, and I know that you kind of alluded to it before in your introduction, was there a personal or a family connection that really drew you to the story of Samaná?
Well, as I mentioned, I grew up in Puerto Rico, right? So my last name, Mann-Hamilton, is not, for one, a Puerto Rican last name or a Dominican last name for that matter. And so people always ask me about, where I was from and everything else. And my response would always be very short and say, well, I was born and raised in Puerto Rico, and sort of that was sufficient. But I really never connected to my own family history through that conversation and such. And so I just started asking questions, really, with my aunts first, my mom, my aunts, family, sort of trying to figure out, again, why the last name, the Hamilton, and of course then with the Vanderhorst and the Copeland, there's all these other last names that are part of our history. And so those responses were sometimes fruitful, sometimes like, oh, I don't know. And so I just kept digging and digging and digging and really just sort of finding different sources, trying to find the story itself of how, again, my family arrives in the context of Samaná itself, in the context of the Caribbean. And so after, a little bit digging and digging with the family members and such, I actually found a wonderful archive at the Arturo Schomburg Research Institute here in New York City. It's a series of interviews and some work done by Jose Vigo, who was a linguist himself, and he had gone to Samaná and he had done all these interviews. And some of those interviews were, for example, one of them was with my great-grandmother, in this case, Dora Vanderhorst, and some other members of the community as well. And so, again, sort of starting to dig deeper into that history. So it really was about just finding out, again, who I was, where I came from, all those very important questions for oneself, one's identity, and then really just sort of took off in a different direction, right? Because, again, as I found that story, the details of it was just so beautiful to me, right? To understand that it wasn't just my family, that many other families were part of this process. Again, the juncture of not just African-American, but Afro-Caribbean, Afro-Haitian, right? All these different things, all these different communities coming together in the space itself, I really became enamored. And so I've been doing that work, as I said, for the last maybe 15 years or so, in the community, outside of, and educational spaces as well, public spaces, right? So wherever anyone wants to hear the story, I'm willing to tell it and willing to participate in spreading it.
No, thank you for that, because as most genealogists or family historians will say, yes, it's a spark that you just want to continue digging deeper to find what you can find. So that's a great response. So, and then for listeners that are unfamiliar with the region, where exactly is Samaná and what makes it historically significant?
So Samaná is on what would be the northeastern peninsula of the Dominican Republic, what is today the Dominican Republic. Samaná, I mean, I could go on for hours on this one, so I won't give you too much, but it's one of the first points of encounter between the indigenous population and the Spaniards themselves in, I think, 1492 and 1493, right? But there's a semi-violent confrontation between them. Samaná has just very important historical moments throughout its history itself. Well, throughout the history that we know, right? After discovery and so on and so forth, or after the arrival of the Europeans themselves, right? And so I was just fascinated as I dug deeper into the local history itself, just finding all these different moments. For example, thinking about very early on, by 1510, there was maroon communities in the mountains of Samaná who were again escaping enslavement. So this is, if you think about it, for some of the first early maroon communities in the Americas themselves who have withstood the test of time and are still in those different spaces themselves. And so just sort of encountering these different histories, different moments, different migrations to the space itself, and then obviously understanding when my family arrives and who they mix with and everything else, right? Yeah, it really, for me, it's the story of the Caribbean in general, right? I think that many of us like to think about our Caribbean spaces in very unique ways and sort of nationalistic ways, like, well, I'm Jamaican or I'm this or that. And so I think the story of Samaná is that, again, the coming together from all these different spaces, right? I can say my family from Cuba, from Haiti, from St. Kitts, from Nevis, from Puerto Rico, right? From all these different spots. And they arrive and they make home in the space of Samaná. And from there, right, another story begins.
Yes, absolutely. And then, your article does explore the themes of Blackness and how identity is understood and expressed within the Samaná community. Could you just explore, let us know a little bit more about that?
Well, again, it's understanding where these folks are coming from, right? So different points in the eastern United States itself, but many of them were members of the AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is the first black church in the context of the United States itself. And so as part of that sort of, I guess, philosophy, right, it was about solidarity, it was about community, it was about blackness, right, in the context of the United States where blackness in many ways is reviled. It's still legal to enslave people and all these different things. And so really their departure to me is the most astounding thing about the whole process, right? Again, think about 1824, no, very few newspapers, no Google, no maps, no things, right? So, they're going off of, again, ideas at the end of the day, the idea of freedom and what that freedom may look like, because of course they don't have that in the context of the United States. And so again, to pick up your family and to travel to an island, in this case, that they know very little about, right? It's entrusting their life in this case and their future in the hands of God, right? As part of the AME Church itself, right? But it's about an uplift philosophy, and it's about making sure that black communities are strong, that they can make decisions for themselves in this case, educate themselves, right? Do all these different things, and that was the opportunity that they were afforded, right? Not just to be free, but also to own land, right? Things again that they were not given access to in the context of the United States, and so to me, that's the most fascinating part, right? How do you make that decision to leave, to get on this boat, to go to, well, you don't know where at the end of the day, or you don't know where you're going to arrive and what you're going to be given and all these different things, or what the realities of that space may be. And yet they still took that plunge, right? If you want to call it that. They still took that journey to the Caribbean, and in this case stayed. I'm the first generation, at least in my specific family, to return to the U.S. And now my daughter has been born here in Brooklyn. So, right, we are reimagining these spaces in different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, it's just taking that leap of faith to say that there's something better than what they know, which is quite huge in and of itself. But we'll get to that migration in just a few more questions. But I just wanted to touch upon in terms of the 1946, the Great Fire at Samaná that destroyed many community records. What impact did this loss have on reconstructing, family and migration histories?
Well, what's interesting about the 1946 fire, and I write about it in different ways, right? And so the mention is in the local history is that many of, obviously, the documents and all these different things burned down, and it is reality. But we actually found a lot of these documents housed in different locations in the community as well. And so not everything was lost. It's a good thing. But in terms of, like, for example, a lot of the documents that were lost were mostly government sort of issued documents, stuff like that. So very important, right? Again, in terms of thinking about documentation about people's citizenships, access to certain things, access to land at the end of the day. Many of the land records themselves were lost in that process as well. And so it's been a little confusing in terms of thinking about, again, who owns land, who gives titles to land, right? Who respects those titles. And unfortunately, in the present mood in Samaná, there's a lot of tourism, a lot of outsiders coming in to buy up that land. And so there's a lot of misdealings with people's land.
Yes.
So yes, many of the documents were lost, right? But not everything was lost, and that's the beautiful thing. And so we've been able to, for example, find at the AME Church, at the Evangelical Church as well, boxes of documents. We've been able to conserve them. We've been able to transcribe them, look at them, make them available to larger segments of the community as well. And there we have marriage documents, birth documents, church notes, stuff like that, right? A lot of different things. But unfortunately, there is a lot of missing information, and the reality is, the local government, the national government of the Dominican Republic has given very little care towards looking into these movements and migrations themselves.
No, definitely. And then, of course, we'll just go on to the next, which is, what are the repositories or archives did you rely on for your research, and what challenges did you face in terms of uncovering these accurate records?
Well, again, in the context of the Dominican Republic, it was really more private spaces. So either families that have maintained records over time, the church itself that has maintained some of those records, perhaps not well maintained, but at least some of the things can be found there. Within the National Archive of the Dominican Republic, very little is actually available in regards to this migration itself. In the United States, spaces like the Schomburg Research Institute in Harlem, Library of Congress, for example, South Carolina Historical Society, Philadelphia Historical Society, right? You really have to sort of piece these things together in different ways. One of the trips that I did in terms of doing the research, I went down to Philadelphia to the AME Church there, hoping to have found some type of document or whichever war that spoke to the migration in some way or form, having been organized by the AME, especially the AME Philadelphia Church. And unfortunately, I found absolutely nothing. And so I ended up, rather than finding anything, I ended up depositing items there. Hey, these folks in Samaná, they think about Philadelphia. And although we could talk about that a little bit in detail later on, right? But many of them, the memory is Philadelphia's home, right? And they're always thinking about this, in this case, 200 years later. And then here in Philadelphia, you have no recognition of them or no memory of them. Something's wrong with that. And so, I had that communication. And unfortunately, we've tried in different ways to do a little bit more with the Philadelphia Church, but that hasn't worked out yet. But give up.
No, it's always a challenge, but I'm sure you'll find resolution there. So let's go on to the migration piece itself. What motivated, the African Americans to move to Samaná? And what was this migration? Was it voluntary, or was it influenced by other external forces?
So I think in terms of motivation, I think the main motivation is, again, just having equal access to anything in life in general, right? As Black people in the context of the United States, right? Constantly having the threat of re-enslavement, the threat of, right, of the policing of everything that's going on in the context of the United States itself, lack of access to, for example, even having Black communities preach to themselves, right? That was also becoming difficult. Access to land, to resources, to education, right? So at the end of the day, anything that would have provided them a leg up within that society, right? And so they were, most of the folks who went to not just Samaná, to Haiti in general, right? They were folks who had an education, who had a career in some way or form, right? Whether technical or whatever, and so they were really seeking just to be able to do these things without impediment at the end of the day, right? To seek out a future where they could, right? Where their hard work, their faith, their practiced self could give them a leg up within society. And that wasn't really something that they were able to do in the United States. And so Haiti, again, as the first Black republic in the Americas, offering other Black folk, in this case, in the context of the Americas, that freedom, that's not just freedom of religion, freedom of language itself, of culture, of, again, access to land itself that they were given once they arrived there. To me, that's the basis of, at the end of the day, what most of us yet don't have in the context of the United States or the Caribbean, for that matter, right? Land, right? All these different things, right? So 200 years later, that is still a question that I'm still thinking about at the end of the day, and I think many people are still thinking about, especially with our current government, right? So I think, to me, I always, again, I laugh when, like, I usually say this to people. My family left here 200 years ago, and I'm the dumbass who returned, right? Because to me, in the Caribbean is always much better, but be here for now.
Yes, and just to clarify, these African Americans, they were free from the United States going to Haiti or eventually to Samaná.
For
Is
the
that
most part, the majority of them were free. I'm sure that a few of them may have made the journey escaping something, so perhaps
okay?
had not been granted their freedom as of yet, and were able to journey on one of these boats and, of course, gain their freedom through doing so. I didn't answer the second part of that question, was in terms of thinking about the influences themselves. So, and this is all very much self-organized in that regard, right? So you have Jonatas Granville, who is a representative of the government of Boyer, who was sent to, in this case, Philadelphia and other places on the eastern seaboard to recruit African American communities to come down, right? So, right, there's a form of recruitment, right? He links up with the AME Church and Richard Allen. In fact, I think it's Richard Allen's son is one of the people who actually makes that migration as well. And so there's a whole series of discussions going on at this point in time, right? Also, because at the same time, there's other groupings who are trying to get African Americans to leave the country, but not for their own benefit, just to they didn't want them to be there anymore or be part of the milieu. And so there's the whole, migration to Liberia as well that's being organized sort of at the same period of time and such. But this is really, again, very much self-organized by the Black community themselves and saying, hey, this is an opportunity for us to do these things. And many of them, again, from Philadelphia, from Boston, from New York, from South Carolina, from Baltimore, for example, for a lot of different cities, they're departing, right, with the hope of, again, anything that might be better than the context that they're in.
And this was in the early 1800s. Is that correct?
That begins in 1824. The larger scale migration, 1824 until 1826. But for example, one of the families, the Vanderhorst family, which is part of my lineage as well, they don't actually get down there till 1844. So again, it's a long period of time. But I would say in terms of numbers, the larger numbers are 1824 to 1826.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, just wanted to set that. And then, of course, in your article, you mentioned about the 50 pounds of coffee. Would you be able to explain its significance in understanding this migration movement?
I think you got me on that question, to be honest. So the 50,000 pounds of coffee really is, again, what's sort of sent by the Haitian government with Jonatas Granville to basically to be able to trade, right? To get some money, accumulate some funds so that they can start paying for all these different voyages to the context of Haiti, right? So that's what the context of the coffee is. And we also have to think about, again, at this point in time, Haiti, well, actually, I don't know. I'm not sure when they received recognition from the United States. I'm not a historian, right? But this is a longer process of, right, the United States not wanting to trade with Haiti in any way or form or support this Black Republic. And so this is all going on at the same period of time, right?
Mm.
And so these folks, they're finding ways to finance these things, right? Making sure that this is a feasible project, a reality in this case, right? Not just to get them down there, but once they get down there, to give them the services that they need, to give them the land that's needed for them, right? To sustain themselves over time, right? So this is how they were going to fund it, right? Through the coffee, through other means as well, right? Through trade at the end of the day, whatever they were able to produce in the context of Haiti itself.
Exactly. And, you emphasize the importance of faith and how religion and holding on to their God shape their resilience and community structure. Could you just explore a little bit of this in terms of, I guess, with their cultural practices and their beliefs and traditions?
So again, the majority of them go as part of the African Methodist Episcopal, and so they create their congregation once they arrive in Samaná. At different points in time, they do have representatives of the AME Church who are part of the structure. Later on, they become Wesleyan. Later on in 1930, for example, one of the churches becomes evangelical as well, again, because they're seeking support from larger structures. They sort of lose connection to the AME Church at different points in time, and so they look for other spaces to really support their endeavor. But that, again, that space of religion is a space where culture is maintained, a space where language is maintained, family structures are maintained, again, hymnals and songs, right? It's a space of practice, let's just say that. So it's not just an imaginative space. Like, they go there, they practice these things, they have discussions, space of organizing for themselves as well. So, right, it's really at the center of the community itself, especially in Samaná. I think that loses a little bit of its power over time, right? So, for example, today, a lot of the youth don't attend church anymore, are not so much interested in some of those ideas, and very very much less connected to that history in many ways and the culture itself, right? They have become Dominicans over time.
And I guess, I know that you mentioned where some of the African Americans came from in the United States, but can you just say, in terms of what that influence would have been like in terms of in the development of the Samaná culture?
Sorry, repeat that.
Like from where the migrants came, like from the African Americans, where they came from in the United States. I know that you mentioned it earlier as to one of your answers, but how would that, from these different locations within the United States, did that influence the development of Samana culture?
Hmm. I think this is where sometimes it's difficult to ascertain some of that information, especially, for example, when we think about departure. Many of these ships that departed from these different ports in the eastern seaboard, they didn't have a list of passengers or anything like that. And so what that does is there's a larger narrative within the community that says that everyone came from Philadelphia when that's not actually a reality, right? That's the memory that's maintained over time. It's like Philadelphia is home because many of the migrants came from there, right? But again, when you start breaking down the names and locations, everything, all these different things, it's a very different story. For example, the Hamiltons, I've been able to find out they came from Baltimore, right? The Copelands, which is part of my family as well, which becomes Copling in the context of Dominican Republic, they came from Philadelphia specifically, right? The Vanderhorst side comes via South Carolina, Charleston specifically, arrives in New York, and then goes to Puerto Plata, and then arrives in Samaná, right? So they're all different stories, different locations, different spaces. But I think that they gravitate again to the space of Samaná because there is an actual community there that is maintaining, right, their identity throughout time in this different space. And so in terms of thinking about their backgrounds, right, again, most of these folks are coming from coastal communities, right? Whether it be Boston, right? Perhaps not tropical, right? But
Yes.
coastal communities, right? So they are accustomed to the maritime life. They're accustomed to building ships. They're accustomed to agriculture. They're accustomed to all the different things that at the end of the day, they get access to in the space of Samaná. What is different really is just we're thinking about the climate, right? Tropics itself. So I'm sure that they have to adjust to products that they can grow, but at the same time, now they can grow these things year round, right? Whereas in the context of the United States, it's maybe just a season that they have to grow these things, right? So there's a incredible transmutation of practices and all these different things of the language itself to the space of Samaná, partly because there's very little else in Samaná, right? And that's a good thing and a bad thing, right? In different ways, right? But again, they arrive into this space that is in many ways virgin, right? There's not a large population there that exists prior to, and so they're able to establish themselves and maintain themselves over time.
Yeah, exactly. And, how did, I guess, with the early settlers go about, of course, building community and sustaining themselves economically?
Well, the building community is again they came as a community, so I think that they didn't have to build it perhaps, and that's the let's say the easier part of this process, right? They come as a community, they know each other, they have a background with each other in some way or form. They're coming from the AME Church, right? Upon arrival, then that's a different beast, if you want to call it that, right? Of course, again, these families are given land in different parts of the peninsula, so they are in many ways subdivided, right? Many of them later gravitate towards the town of Samaná and have their lands outside in the more rural areas themselves, right? But I think that's where it gets a little bit more difficult in that process. Remind me the last part of that question. Sorry.
No, just how they sustain them, like in terms of sustain themselves, in terms of what, I guess, crops that they grow type of thing.
So really, it just depends on the background of some of these immigrants. A lot of them, like I said, were shipbuilders. And so they dedicated their life in Samaná to building ships and had their own ships and took commerce across the Caribbean, different spaces, different islands, and so on and so forth. There were some of them that were agricultural workers, so they tended to the land and established different plantations and such. There were folks like, for example, would be my grandfather. He was a zapatero. Zapatero is he made shoes. Right. And again, that was a tradition from the family itself, right? So he was taught by his father and so on and so forth, right? So his role was to make shoes for the members of the community, right? Everyone had sort of their own little niche, if you want to call it, right? What they could produce and help out and support the community in some way or form. And at the end of the day, sometimes they had to do all of those things, and this is where, again, you sit down to listen to oral histories of the community, right? They'll say, well, grandpa at this point, he was a shoe, he was making shoes, but, that didn't make enough money. So then he started training horses, right? And that didn't go so well. So he went out into the ocean and started fishing. And then there was an accident. And so the boat sunk and he can't come back to land. And then they started producing more agriculture, right? So it's really just finding ways to survive at the end of the day, finding ways to subsist, right? And not having any limits in that regard, right? So whatever they would do, whatever they could do, they would find ways to do so.
And I guess in what ways did they, trade or interact with the wider Caribbean and, of course, the Atlantic world?
So this is one of the things that I try to do in the work of Samaná that I've been doing research-wise is to go against this idea of isolation, right? I think that many authors who have written around Samaná, many folks who talk about Samaná, they talk about the cultural retention, the linguistic retention as something that's there because they were isolated from the rest of the world. No, quite the opposite. If you actually look, what you'll see is, well, one thing that's interesting about Samaná in itself is an island off the coast of what would be the Dominican Republic. It's only on the end of the 1800s that it becomes reconnected, and then there becomes a road that crosses, right? So for the most part, the only way that you would get to Samaná was by boat. And in doing so, again, as an open port in the Caribbean, it's open to everyone. So, right? So you have boats coming from Europe, you have boats coming from across the Caribbean, you have boats coming from New Orleans, from Louisiana, right, that are arriving in this space, right? So you have a constant flow of people, of commerce, of goods, of information that arrives in this space, whereas perhaps in other parts of what was then the Dominican Republic, you did not have access to these different things, right? And so with that, right, to me, that's the most important part. Again, they are not isolated, so everything that they're doing is in connection to something else and in response in many ways to something else as well, right? And they are, again, receiving all this information all the time about what's going on in the Atlantic world, in the United States as well. They get news from there and they're like, yeah, I'm not going there. Slavery's still running wild over there. Like this is not, but it also creates concerns for them, right? And for example, in the 1870s, the United States becomes interested in the peninsula of Samaná. And one of the first questions that they're asking, right, when they're being interviewed about the possibility of Samaná being annexed to the United States, they're like, "Are you going to bring back slavery?"
Yeah.
Like we're not, we've been free for a minute. We're not trying to go down that rabbit hole once again.
Yes.
So yeah, they're always connected and they're always participating in different events, right? In terms of thinking, for example, in the independence movements in Dominican Republic against Spain, against other aspects as well. In moments when the U.S. intervenes into the Dominican Republic and Haiti at the same time, a lot of Samaneses are fighting against these interventions themselves, right? So this is home. This becomes home for them, and they make sure that they are participants in the homemaking, the space making itself, to make sure that it is theirs.
Yeah, absolutely. And did other Caribbean migrants also settle in Samaná? And how did that contribute to the community's cultural blend as well?
So again, going back to this idea of isolation, right? The way that they maintain language and culture and at the same time some of the customs is through not just the arrival of other African Americans later on, but through the arrival of Afro-Caribbean folks.
Yes.
So, for example, my great grandmother came from Nevis. She was an English teacher. So she arrives from Nevis to Samaná to teach English to the community, partly because, again, there's a community that needs, right, English instruction, and no one could do it locally. So they're seeking out people to do this work. And this is a reality of much of Samaná. Many of the families there are both African American and Afro Caribbean, right? From Nevis, from St. Kitts, from Santa Cruz, for example, from St. John's. You have all these different locations nearby that folks are migrating to, and likewise, folks are migrating out of, right? At different points in time, right? When there are conflicts in one island, people come to Samaná. When there are conflicts nearby Samaná, folks pick up and go somewhere else, again, to seek their safety and make sure that they can, right, seek stability at the end of the day. So yes, the story of Samaná is not just one of, again, isolation. It's one about migration, and constant movement of people, not just Afro-Caribbean either, right? We have Lithuanian, we have Palestinian, we have movements from across the Middle East, from Europe, from Latin America, from all these different spaces, you can find movement to Samaná. And I think that's a beautiful part of the story itself, right? There's an intermixture there that happens not just as a community itself, right? But again, thinking about the ideals that they set forth for themselves in this very little, in a space that is not regulated as much by the state or by empire in this case.
Yeah, yeah, and it's just knowing that there is always constant movement. It's nothing that anyone is siloed off, as you said, in isolation. There's always interaction. It's always a dynamic space. For you, like I know many descendants have migrated back to the United States, just as like yourself. How has this, I guess, circle of migration affected those who have left and those who have stayed?
So I would say that the migration, well, there's different moments of return, right? So in 1824, the initial migration, 1824 to 1826, there are many families who go. There are many families who return who don't actually stay. I think Samaná becomes important in that historical story, right, at the end of the day, because many of them stay, right? Even though there is coming back and forth here and there, different families, right? But the majority of them do stay and maintain their roots there. We do have, I would say, a more recent phenomenon of out-migration from Samaná to places like New York, for example. So in Washington Heights, there is a large community of Samaneses. Not all of them are descendants of African Americans themselves, right? But some of them and many of them are. I don't so much think it has affected, really, to be honest, the community that much. What I many times find interesting is that many of them who have returned, who are members of that African American descendant community, don't actually know those connections. They sort of left them apart, right? Lost them, right? They arrive here as Dominicans. They don't see themselves anymore in that African American vein. Not to say that everyone does that, right? But many of them, I would say. And so I think that's where there's a sort of a right. For me, when I return to this city, I'm like, oh, I'm returning to the space where my people left at the end of the day. But that's because I know that story. Like I know the Vanderhorst family had a pickle store on Church Street in Manhattan, right? I haven't been able to locate the actual store, right? But I walk those streets. I'm like, we were here, right? We were a part of this 200 years ago in this, whenever that might be, right? But I don't think that a lot of the younger folks and a lot of the folks who are having that migration now have that story. And the few that do, like I mentioned to you earlier, it's not New York that they think of home. It's Philadelphia, right? And likewise, I'm not sure if they make it to the space of Philadelphia either, right? So,
it's just that main narrative that's always remained and told. And for you, I guess for language and oral storytelling appear to be powerful threads that really bind the community. How do these traditions preserve the memory and, of course, belonging? Because as you mentioned, people remember that they come from Philadelphia.
I think it's that memory that has maintained the story alive, right?
Okay.
I mean, there's publications here and there. I think the first one is Elsie Clues Parson, like the 1920s, 1930s. She writes about this very briefly, like, oh, these people exist, right? They're there, and they have these spirituals that they sing outside of church. And like, wow, like it's a very brief, right? And then 1940s, Harry Hotink writes about this. He's a Dutch sociologist, right? So there are certain moments where this is given importance, but beyond that, there's not a lot else, right? And so oral history really is the way, again, that's maintained in the local community, right? And so you can go to a lot of the elders still out there and they'll tell you this whole story. They'll tell you their family history. They'll be able to tell you details of these different things, right? But there is a generational rift, right? Those elders have maintained that story strong. But I think today a lot of the youth do no longer really engage with that history in any way or form, right? And that's where hopefully some of the work that we're doing, myself and some other folks, right, is to, right, remember in different ways, right? Not just writing articles or whichever, or which is one way, right? But creating archives, taking images, right? Whatever way that may take, right? But there are other ways that these stories can and should be maintained, not just within the community, but also outside of. And so, for example, I think I'm doing now this podcast with you. I've done a few others, and I've gotten responses from other folks who like, they listen to it and they're like, oh, wait, I'm looking at this too, right? So I think all this work is about connection at the end of the day, right? Connecting not just to our past, our present, our future, right? But to the different communities, different families, different spaces that are part of this larger tale. And again, just seeing how connected we are in so many ways, not just through the history, but again, through the present as well.
Exactly. It just shows that we're just all interconnected. It just shows past that we're all very, very similar. But again, not that we were just isolated and no one knew about us type of thing. So finally, Professor Mann-Hamilton, would you be able to, what message would you or reflection would you like the listeners to take away about the importance of remembering these forgotten migrations?
Well, I think that all of us, let me start with this. So obviously I'm focused on this migration itself because this is my own family history. I think that if we all dig deeper into our own histories, into our own processes, we will find that perhaps your family didn't move to the Caribbean, move to Haiti, right? But they came from somewhere else. And more than likely, if you go a few generations back, you'll find that they actually came from somewhere else that you didn't even imagine, right? So that's what for example, in my classroom, that's what I do with my students, right? I ask them questions about themselves, whichever or, but one of the projects that I have them do every year is that I want you to do oral history with your families in some way or form. It doesn't have to be with your family, but with someone, right, who's an elder of the Caribbean community, right? Because at the end of the day, right, connecting to those stories, connecting that history to those experiences, but what they're also connecting to is different spaces, right? And this is what I wanted to imagine. Many students would be like, well, I'm Jamaican. I'm like, okay, well, but where's your mother from? Well, my mom's actually Dominican. I'm like, well, but why don't you consider yourself Dominican? Like, so these are questions that are, especially when we talk about the Caribbean, it's never a simple answer. And that's what I want them to think about, right? You can say you're Jamaican, that's fine. You can be proud of it. You can say you're Dominican, you can be proud of it. You can say Puerto Rican, you'd be proud of it. But if you actually dig a little deeper, you'll find that you're much more than that. And that's okay. And that's beautiful as well, right? That these movements that people are making, the places that they go, it's because they're seeking the better conditions for themselves in some way or form, right? And so I think it's important that we hold on to those stories in so many different ways, precisely because I think that, especially today, people perceive themselves as stuck in a space, in a reality that they don't control, in a government that doesn't seem very friendly to them in any way or form. And so when I listen to these stories, when I see these stories, when I see the documents, all these different things, right? They weren't out there causing a revolution, but they were making change in a different way. And that's the beautiful thing about it, right? That I think that people today imagine change is only has to be like you have to change the thing, right? Like, well, change happens sometimes very slowly, sometimes quickly, in different ways. It's change of direction. Sometimes it's left and right, right? All these different ways, but it's constant, right? And that's something I think that these folks in many ways embraced the constancy, but also the change as well.
No, and it's just holding and having a different narrative as to what is popularly known, to say that my story is different. My story is this, and then having that connectedness, because I find that it just really centers you and really gives you, this is who I am, so to speak, because I have all of these ancestors behind me as well. So, thank
It can also, for me, it just gives me a sense of comfort in many ways, right? As I said when we began the conversation, right? I came at this because I didn't understand perhaps who I was or where I came from or why I was certain ways or why I looked at the world in different ways than perhaps my friends and my colleagues and everyone else. That's like, trying to find an understanding. And so as I connect with my history, I understand myself a lot more. Right? I understand why I am in certain ways. I understand why I don't root myself in one place, right? I root myself in multiple places because that's been the reality of family for so long, of people for so long, right? And so, yeah, that's what that history allows me to do. Is it gives me a little bit of freedom, gives me a little bit of confidence as well, and it gives me a little bit of understanding that, again, we are different, the same, and yet we are.
Here we are. Yes, exactly. Here we are. So thank you so much for coming on to the podcast and discussing your article, because this has been great. And to be, as I said, just these other narratives that are just not told centrally out there, and that these are just as important. And once you're starting to dig through, then you start, as you said, uncovering a lot more than what is ever known. So thank you.
Oh, of course. Thank you for the invitation, and keep watch, because we're working right now on an edited volume. So there's two scholars and myself who are working together on doing this, again, using not just academic texts, of course, and documents and everything else, but also the voices from the community itself, right? That need to be heard, that need to be given power in this case, right? Exactly. So this is a continuing job, continuing work in communion with the community itself, of course. And then as we do that work, we connect with more and more of these folks who were part of this migration, or not just this migration, right? But who have similar stories to other islands, other places themselves, right? And so we can, of course, connect in those ways as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because again, this narrative, we're not, as I said, these islands were not siloed. Just what everybody just lived there, died there. There was a lot of movement back and forth continually. And depending who the colonial power was, they moved within the colonies that colonial power owned as well. So it's only when you start uncovering and looking at the records, you're like, but this is different, and you're shocked and you're just going, interesting how this is now come undone. And you're able to see that and talk to that. So no, I can definitely relate.
Yeah, maybe I'll end with this. One of the documents that I found, I think, going back to the United States Commission of Inquiry into annexing Samaná, one of the people who was sent on that voyage was Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass arrives as a secretary of the mission. They go to Samaná and they're doing certain things, right? Frederick Douglass also part of the AME Church in the United States, right? So he knows that they're there. He knows the community exists. I think that's partly why he's sent as part of the mission as well. So when he arrives in Samaná, he's talking to all these folks, right? Talking about the possible annexation of Samaná to the U.S. and asking them questions. And one of the people that he interviews is, I guess, would be my great-great-grandfather. And so I'm looking at this document. I was like, wait, this is my family member, right? Talking in this case to Frederick Douglass. I'm like, holy shit, wow, this is blows my mind.
Exactly.
Just to hear the words, right?
Yeah.
Or to hear them, to read the words in this case, right? To think about why they're there, to think about what they're doing, to think about, again, what they're worried about, all these different things. To me, that's just fascinating. It's a glimpse into their reality, but it's a glimpse that, again, many people of African descent, we don't have that glimpse into our history because there's very little documentation about these things. And so being able to find these documents, to see these things, like even when we were doing the work of archiving the church documents, I was able to find my grandfather's birth certificate, his communion certificate, and see like all these connections and the families he was connected with and through friendship in this case, right? Those are details that to me are just fascinating, right? They're also very personal, but they tell you this larger story, right? About this community, about people themselves, and about choices that people make themselves, right? To find freedom, happiness, family, or just to be left alone at the end of the day.
Their own peace, whatever that may be, defined.
Their own piece of land, their own peace of mind, their own piece of, yes, anything. Peace, yes.
But no, thank you again. Thank you so much. This has been, we can go on for even longer, but no, thank you so much for your time and telling these stories, because these are the things that connect us all in Proving the Vote. So thank you.
Thank you. Again, thank you for the invitation.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode. And if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you.